Welcome to the Boston University Institute for Philosophy and Religion 2024 Spring Lecture Series on the topic, Can Virtue Be Taught? My name is David DeCosimo, and I'm director of the Institute, as well as being associate professor here in the School of Theology. The Institute for Philosophy and Religion was founded over 50 years ago by teachers of, graduate advisors and teachers of Martin Luther King Jr. And these teachers came from three different disciplines, from the Department and Study of Religion, from the School of Theology, and the Department of Philosophy. And these are, if you're in the university now, you know that these are disciplines that sometimes don't really talk to each other. And yet, in that moment, there was a rich interchange among those faculties. And as they watched higher education in general and Boston University in particular begin to transform itself in a certain direction, they were concerned. In particular, they were worried that what was being gained in the way of conceptual rigor, specialization, deeper learnedness was coming too often at the cost of the foregrounding of engagement with basic human questions, the layperson's questions about existence, meaning, self, religion, politics, and they wanted to secure in the university an enduring foothold for engagement with those questions that was marked by intellectual seriousness, but also with an invitational posture that would draw in students and a broader public so that together we could think about the most important things with excellence and in good company. And that has been the mission of the Institute for 50 years. Now, this year, our topic is at once perennial and enduring, with roots in the very origins of the Western philosophical tradition, and at the same time, I think incredibly pressing and urgent, particularly in regard to the relationship of the university and higher education with respect to the question of what the role is of the university in shaping young people and future citizens. And at times it can seem as though the university is caught between two increasingly less attractive alternatives. On the one hand, the almost hegemonic moral vocabulary of the contemporary university is a certain vision of identity-focused justice, narrowly conceived. And especially in the aftermath of this past fall, that vision is increasingly shown to be inadequate to the complexity of our ethical and political lives. On the other hand, the alternative that the university tends to embrace is one of a kind of technical and instrumentalist-focused vision of principles of absolute neutrality, of academic freedom, and of a refusal to take a stand in relationship to particular substantive goods. And the question that confronts us at this moment in higher education for faculty, but also for students, is the question of how or whether the university might find a different way, a way potentially of engaging questions of virtue and of formation that is public but not partisan, that is shared but not sectarian. And the effort to interrogate and examine that possibility is at the heart of the lecture series this spring. And in that respect, I'm delighted to be introducing and welcoming Dr. Tal Brewer. Dr. Brewer is professor of philosophy at the University of Virginia, where he's also a senior fellow in the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. He received his PhD from Harvard University, his MA from Tufts, and his undergraduate degree from Duke. A moral philosopher, Dr. Brewer has published numerous scholarly articles in many of the most respected journals in the field of philosophy. His 2009 Oxford University Press book, The Retrieval of Ethics, is rightly considered a classic. Right at the start of the book, Dr. Brewer draws a distinction between two sorts of things that we might call virtue ethics. One treats ancient Greek talk and text concerned with virtues as supplying fresh answers to contemporary ethical questions, questions that philosophers themselves right now are already asking. Virtue ethics, in this sense, represents another item on a menu of options alongside something called utilitarianism and something else called Kantianism. This approach, he says, has become almost entirely dominant. There is, he claims, another far more radical thing that we might call virtue ethics. And this vision of virtue ethics involves challenging the entire practice of contemporary moral philosophy and of much else besides. It questions the very questions moral philosophers are asking. It looks to figures such as Elizabeth Anscombe and Alistair MacIntyre, and in a different vein, Iris Murdoch, for inspiration. Dr. Brewer is an ethicist of this latter sort. Perhaps only 1 in 50 professional philosophers is actually a lover of wisdom. And that's true of any discipline we might pick, and the ratio may be lower still than that. To be a lover of wisdom is to be someone for whom the work and writing of philosophy represents an effort from the very core of who they are to make sense of and speak to the depth and reality and messy complexity of what it is to be a human who learns, who grieves, who loves. Dr. Brewer is, in my view, a lover of wisdom. And as such, I can think of no better guide to help us think about how to grapple with and understand the radical challenge and change that phenomena like ChatGPT and Midjourney represent. I'm thus delighted to welcome him to BU and eager to learn from and think with him. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Brewer as he lectures on Word by Word, Writing, Humanity, and AI.
Am I coming through? Okay, good, good. Well, such a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming. Let me dive right in. For years, we professors were said to be next in line for technological unemployment. There was, it must be admitted, an unsettling logic to this prediction. In-person instruction at a residential college is a notably expensive undertaking. Campuses have to be built, dormitories and classrooms maintained, lawns and playing fields tended, and students must be housed and fed, provisioned with libraries and exercise facilities and health centers and campus police forces and bus systems. And after all of that, if the two classes a student most wants to take happen to meet at the same time, out of luck, the student can only take one of them. Not long ago, this would have seemed like an unavoidable fact of life. People have to gather someplace if they're going to gather at all, and no one can be in two places at once. But to a Silicon Valley entrepreneur or to the rapidly growing managerial caste within institutions of higher education, this no longer seems like a fact of life. It seems like a problem to be solved. And one commonly proposed solution is to videotape lectures and make them available to students at the time and place of their choosing. Then students can take any course they want at an affordable cost without even leaving home. All those amenities we mentioned a moment ago don't need to be brought into existence. And professors can be relieved of the need to repeat their sometimes stale performances year after year, which is to say we can be relieved of our jobs. Well, this, at any rate, was what certain self-proclaimed seers used to say was on the verge of happening. hardly anyone is saying it right now. They've fallen silent largely because the COVID pandemic gave us an all too long look at what it would mean to do our teaching and learning online from the comfort, or should I say the confines, of our homes. When students were finally able to return to campus, even the mandatory masks could not quite hide their joy. As long as the memory of the COVID years remains fresh, and that won't be all that much longer, it'll be hard to generate enthusiasm for moving higher education online, or so I think. As a member of the professoriate, I'm of course pleased with our reprieve. Yet this sliver of good news does not mean that academia has been spared the disruptions that have been visited upon almost every aspect of our lives by the fast movers and thing breakers of the high-tech sector. Things have changed, even in the slow-moving world of academia. Things have changed. I don't think they're changing for the better. Quite the opposite. I think we're on the verge of intellectual and cultural bankruptcy. I think it was Hemingway who said that bankruptcies happen in two ways, gradually and then suddenly. In our case, the moment of sudden change arrived a little more than a year ago with the release to the public of what is, for college students facing paper deadlines, nothing short of a genie in a magic lamp. This genie, the first one we were introduced to, goes by the name of ChatGPT, though other genies with similarly magical powers have appeared since. Unlike the genies of lore, these new genies place no limit on the number of jams they'll get you out of, with a push of a button and half an hour of editing to hide the evidence, maybe by inserting some sophomoric musings or a few grammatical errors or a non sequitur or two. Almost any writing assignment can be finished in a jiffy and passed off as one's own. What troubles me most about this dazzling new technology is not that it has made it easy to cheat, though I suppose it has. A much more serious concern by my lights is that it has called into question one of the most familiar and, to this point, most persuasive justifications for traditional humanities course requirements, namely that the writing skills cultivated in humanities classes are needed to excel in almost any highly paid career. This claim was plausible a scant 16 months ago. Now it seems to me increasingly dubious. My guess, for what it's worth, is that few companies will continue to have their employees write documents or even long emails from scratch. Why pay someone to do what can be done with the push of a button at a quality that is rapidly approaching what's needed for most private or public sector purposes? If our main objective as educators really were to prepare students to succeed in the workplace of the future, we should probably stop teaching them to write and start teaching them to coax good writing from AI programs. That is, we should be preparing them for the pretty well-paid positions that have sprouted up for what are called prompt engineers. Some university professors favor such a change, and this does make sense from the point of view of career preparation, but it would be utterly disastrous for liberal education properly understood, and especially for the humanities. I'll try to explain why I think this, but first I want to reflect at some length on the other change I mentioned a moment ago, the gradual one that has left us acutely vulnerable to the sudden one. Let's do a little review of what we've all been through in recent decades, because at least for me, I find it, the changes add up to such a fundamental shift in my way of being that it can be hard to remember what things were like before it all happened. My oldest son is 31 years old. When he was born, there was no such thing as a search engine or a web page. It was not yet possible to share photos or music files online or to shop online. He was 7 years old when Google was founded, 12 when social media appeared, 15 when smartphones and other Wi-Fi enabled devices started to catch on. Now, just 16 years later, almost all of us have the extraordinarily capable computers known as smartphones right in our pockets, always at our fingertips. We can enter the virtual realm at any moment, and many of us find it increasingly difficult to resist the impulse to do so, even for a couple of hours. What we find as we move more and more of our lives into this realm is a curious combination of unbridgeable solitariness and unbounded sociality. We can be alone in our bedroom, yet able to put ourselves in contact with billions of people around the planet. Or hundreds of us can gather in what used to be called public space, in an old-fashioned public space, each of us clicking and tweeting our way through a parallel, non-spatial realm, leaving the streets full of human bodies, but empty of human presence. This same uncanny melange of presence and absence can even be observed at home, where parents and children are increasingly found alongside each other, yet cocooned in mesmerizing solipsism. What has happened in the past 2 decades is that a great deal of daily life has shifted into a novel space with a totally different mode of sociality. It's not easy to find an apt historical precedent for this, a change of a similar magnitude. When I try, I find my thoughts turning to Nietzsche's very striking description of what he regarded as the most radical change, he says, that man had ever experienced. That change, he says, when he found himself finally imprisoned within the of society and of peace. Here's how Nietzsche describes the change in Genealogy of Morals. Just like the plight of water animals when they were compelled either to become land animals or to perish, so was the plight of these half animals, perfectly adapted as they were to the savage life of war, prowling, and adventure. Suddenly, all their instincts were rendered worthless and switched off. Henceforth, they had to walk on their feet, carry themselves, whereas heretofore they had been carried by the water. A terrible heaviness oppressed them. Well, let's suppose that the virtualization of life continues apace, perhaps in line with the current business plans of Meta, who will soon be offering virtual and augmented realities within which our avatars can go on adventures and socialize with each other, or maybe in line with the vision of Google Director of Engineering Ray Kurzweil, who projects that internet connections will be integrated into our neocortex within 1 more decade. At that point, we will have lived through a change that would arguably dwarf the one that Nietzsche regarded as the most radical change in human history. But this change has a very different phenomenology from the one that interested Nietzsche. Nietzsche was interested in the imposition upon primitive human beings of a terrible new weight. Our new form of sociality is marked by tantalizing lightness. Virtual encounters can usually be ended with a tap of the finger, leaving no lasting encumbrances. Nor is it only our relations with others that have been shorn of weight. Frictionlessness is a fundamental design ideal of virtual space, much talked about in Silicon Valley circles. As a result of the effort to achieve the standard of frictionlessness, moving through the virtual world is more like flying than like paddling through water or plodding across land. We were a long way from this engineering achievement in the early days of the internet when we all twiddled our thumbs while waiting for pages to load, but now we flit from place to place with a mere click, and soon it will take only a word or a movement of the eye, and then if Kurzweil's implants really are implanted, it will take a mere wish. As we approach the dream of instant wish fulfillment, we're nearing an ideal that announces itself with the first touch of any new cell phone or computer. I'm old enough to recall what it was like to get an electronic gadget before the computer revolution. Some of you might remember the kind I mean, the kind that could only do 1 or 2 of the dozens of things you can now do with what's still a bit misleadingly called a phone. Maybe a walkie-talkie or a tape recorder or a clock radio. Before you could use this 1 or at most 2 trick pony, you had to open this thing called an owner's manual and give it a thorough reading. Well, new phones and computers are not like that. They take us by the hand, even if we're rank newcomers, and they show us what they can do for us. In his new book, A Web of Our Own Making, Anton Barbacay offers this telling anecdote. I have seen my young niece, barely old enough to toddle and to prate, fully satisfied by a game that consists in nothing other than popping animated bubbles on a screen at her touch. When the time was up, she wept bitterly, and every time. Screen time is like sucking your thumb, an activity that needs little introduction. It recommends itself. Here at the outset, right at the beginning of life with these computers, these new instruments that we're oriented toward, we can already see the seductiveness of the virtual realm, the ease of use, the immediate sense of mastery as part of the come-on, and the principle of seduction governs not only the entry to the realm, but also the words and images found within. As Natasha Schull of MIT has amply documented, the principles of graphic design and content selection used by Las Vegas gambling machines have been transposed to many parts of the virtual realm. As a result, we sometimes lose ourselves for hours on end, then come up for air wondering where the day has gone. When this happens, it is no accident. Quite the contrary, it is, as Schull puts it in the title of her superb book, Addiction by Design. We have, without doubt, reaped enormous benefits from the rise of the virtual realm, but these benefits have been delivered through a business model that has imposed severe costs. The guiding aim of this model is the harvesting and sale of the commodity of human attention. Now, we ordinarily think of a commodity as a bit of the external world that can be used to serve our purposes. But the crucial commodity of the new economy, attention, is fundamentally different. We are its minefields, not its users. Indeed, attention is the very stuff of our inner lives, and it's harvested not to serve our purposes, but to permit others to make us more serviceable to their purposes. And one peculiarity of the market in this commodity is that the original owner almost never consents to the sale explicitly and rarely receives a share of the proceeds. And partly because of this peculiarity, because it can be taken without pay, attention has quickly become the most profitable resource on the planet. 7 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world today are either in the attention brokerage business or in the business of making the hardware and software that this market sector requires. The reshaping of attention, the claiming and selling, and then downstream the reshaping of attention, of what we love and fear, what we desire and deride, has become the most profitable undertaking of the global economy. Public discourse is still largely premised on the idea that market economies excel in providing us with the means to pursue conceptions of the good developed outside of the market. But the contemporary communications industry has staged what amounts to, it seems to me, a hostile takeover of the acculturation of rising generations. It is, I think, a minimal condition of decency in the practice of acculturating children, of raising children, that elders seek to pass along an outlook on life and on the good that they themselves sincerely affirm as worthy of a human being. A minimal condition of decency in acculturation, that strikes me as being. The market-driven practices of acculturation that we have so recently innovated do not appear to meet this minimal condition. These practices require no true believers to do the work of acculturation that they do. They promulgate an outlook on life that almost no one unreservedly affirms. And the profitability of attention brokerage depends in large part on the number of eyeballs harvested. But it also depends on the quality of the harvest. Attention is generally most valuable when it is uncritical, half-hypnotized, suggestible. This is the optimal condition for fostering new desires and encouraging their satiation. It is not an optimal environment for cultivating self-discipline or a capacity for delayed gratification. It's not, then, fertile soil for the long-term aspirations around which a worthy life can be built. So let's imagine a young man who has spent a hefty portion of his first 18 years in this attentional environment. He has grown accustomed to a steady feed, as it's called, of content tailored algorithmically to his personal interests and attentional habits, with the sole object of sustaining his uncritical attention. He will likely have developed he couldn't be blamed for developing an implicit conception of the role in human life of words and images, an idea of what they're for, of how his mind is to meet them. Their job, he might sensibly have come to think, is to win him over. It's their fault, not his, if they fail to do so. His role is either to attend to what he's fed or flit along to some other more immediately compelling content. Well, suppose now that our young man is asked to read the sort of text we study in the humanities. This text does not take him by the hand and show him around. It's not calculated to avoid any moment of affront or confusion or frustration that might induce him to move along to something more inviting. Given the diet of words and images on which he has been suckled, we should expect a difficult adjustment period, if not a complete failure of uptake. And this is not because the text fails to meet the standards to which it ought to be held. It's because the text meets these standards all too well. It's ideally suited, let's say, to disrupt his pleasant fantasies and to occasion growth. And neither the disruption of fantasies nor the ensuing growth is a frictionless experience. The lesson here, I think, is that the humanities will not be readily accessible to those who've had 18 years of the tuition-free education or miseducation currently on offer in the virtual realm. Yet this miseducation is the common denominator of our time. Almost all of our students and all of us adults have been, pretty thoroughly shaped by it by now. So the humanities, I think we can surmise, will be readily accessible to very few of our students. Well, how serious a deprivation is this? Is it really a sign of impending cultural bankruptcy that fewer and fewer college students are devoting their attention to the humanities? Or is this just the hyperbole we should expect from someone whose livelihood depends on a steady supply of humanities majors? Well, we won't be able to answer these questions until we have a clear idea what exactly the humanities are. And these days there's a lot of confusion about this question. Perhaps we can work our way to clarity by beginning with first impressions. Even before classes start, first-year college students will likely notice, while buying their books, that humanities courses typically require an ample stack of original texts, many by long-dead authors, while courses in the natural or social sciences often require only one newly published textbook. If it's more than a few years old, it's probably been updated very recently. This simple observation tells us, I think, something important. It tells us that devotees of the natural and social sciences believe that their fields are making progress and that accumulated insights can be passed along to new generations in summary form without requiring students to retrace the lines of reflection that led to these findings. That may be true for the natural and social sciences, but the humanities are fundamentally different. Nothing of serious value can be extracted from the most beautiful works of literature or poetry or even philosophy and passed along in summary form. Students must grapple directly with the original texts. But what do we hope to do by grappling with these texts? On this question, serious misconceptions abound. If we consult that compendium of prevailing opinion known as Wikipedia and look up the humanities, the very first thing we'll learn is that they are, quote, academic disciplines that study human culture. And if we seek clarification from a widely cited essay by the influential academic just across the river here, Steven Pinker, we will learn that all academic disciplines, including the humanities, are devoted to the pursuit of information. I think both characterizations are misleading. Humanities students do not merely study human culture, at least in the narrow sense of study. They throw themselves into central practices of what is sometimes called high culture, music, for instance, or drawing, or acting, or photography, or painting, or philosophizing, or writing poetry, writing fiction. And when these things go well, today's students will eventually carry these practices to new heights. That marks a fundamental distinction between what is studied in the humanities and the natural sciences. The subject matter of the humanities shifts under us as we throw ourselves into it. In the natural sciences, it's not true that the study itself changes the subject that is understudy. it would be misleading then to say that these various fields are united by their common pursuit, by their common pursuit of information. The humanities can be said to pursue information only if we hear the word information in its original sense, as referring to the formation from within of the student's mind. Now, human beings gain clarity about their proper aspirations by finding the right words for their emergent ideas and by giving full expression to their embryonic creative visions. That is, by self-formative rather than self-descriptive thought. This is how we become who we are properly called to be, both individually and collectively. This formative mode of thought is the stuff of the humanities. The humanities engage intentionally and conscientiously in the same soul-shaping work that the market in attention performs unintentionally as the unbidden cumulative byproduct of corporate profit-seeking. Because humanistic reflection aims at the refinement of one's own first personal perspective, one cannot so much as get started without putting that perspective on the line, without formulating one's own views. This demand is dramatized in the Platonic dialogues, where the identity of the first Western academic institution was being worked out. Plato has Socrates insist upon one simple rule: say what you think. If you don't do that, then your thoughts are not yet in play, not available for assessment or refinement. Humanistic dialogue must begin where you are with your thoughts, precisely so that it can be a self-formative pursuit. And because it begins with what you think and moves forward only when these thoughts alter under the pressure of further conversation and reflection, such inquiry has specific classroom requirements which can't easily be moved online, but it also has a distinctive phenomenology. Progress consists not in the mastering of information, but in the dawning of transformative recognitions. The teacher's role is not authoritative expert, but, to borrow Socrates' metaphor, midwife, helping students give birth to thoughts of their own. When we read Proust or Dostoevsky or Shakespeare, we ourselves come to recognize the depth and insightfulness of the unanticipated vision bequeathed to us. Such writers bring to clarity what's already recognizable to us, even though we have not yet actively recognized it. If they failed in this regard, no team of experts could convince us that they were worth reading nonetheless. But matters are quite otherwise in the sciences. We do not recognize our own inchoate thoughts when we first encounter the idea of heliocentrism or evolution or Einsteinian relativity or quantum entanglement. On the contrary, we're often radically surprised. And here we do rely and ought to rely on the testimony of experts to certify these astonishing ideas as worthy of acceptance. We don't have to come to that realization for ourselves in order to benefit from exposure to these ideas. Socrates' métier was philosophical conversation, but the phenomenology of Socratic learning has clear analogs in other areas of the humanities, including even the visual and performing arts. The composing of a piece of music, for instance, begins with the intimation of a musical possibility and culminates in a finished whole that, in the best of cases, the composer recognizes as just what she was after. The audience must exercise a similar, if less active, recognitional capacity to appreciate the value or shortcomings of the composition. The humanities, then, involve moments of creative or intellectual expression and moments of critical reflection that assess and sometimes refine these expressions. But these are not entirely separate activities. They're different aspects of the central work of every fully human life, the work of individual and collective self-development. Socrates assigns a pivotal role in the cultivation of the human form, human form of being, to logos, that is, to thought or language, or as it's known in familiar New Testament translations, to the word. Now, this strikes me as quite right. to assign centrality in human cultivation to logos. As just noted, even the fine arts depend upon the development of a critical vocabulary and articulate feedback to hone their evolving aspirations. But Socrates distinguishes two fundamentally different uses of logos, a rhetorical use that disfigures us, and a wisdom-loving use that helps us to clarify and come into harmony with our proper calling. This distinction, ancient as it may be, can, I think, illuminate certain dangers posed by contemporary technology. Let's examine the distinction as it appears in the lesser known of Plato's two magisterial treatments of Eros, the Phaedrus. Here we get to listen in on a conversation between Socrates and a young man, Phaedrus, who is torn between the appeal of philosophy and the enticements of the teachers of rhetoric. The choice between these two opposing pictures of a proper education and, by extension, of a well-lived life has suddenly become personal for Phaedrus. He's mulling over a speech and what appears to be a seduction bid delivered earlier that morning by the distinguished orator Lysias. Lysias has argued that it is better to opt for an unloving sexual exchange than the mad ride of an erotic affair. After hearing Phaedrus recount Lysias' speech, actually read Lysias' speech because he has a copy of it in his pocket, he's written it down and recapitulates it for Socrates. After hearing it recapitulated, Socrates offers two speeches of his own. One intended to outdo Lysias' condemnation of erotic liaisons, and another that heaps praises upon the divine madness of love. Socrates then subjects all three of these speeches to scrutiny with an eye to understanding what it is to make proper use of logos. It will turn out that what it is to use words properly is to use them erotically. So this inquiry will be joined at the hip with the earlier discussion in the same dialogue of Eros. And it will turn out that those who are not gripped by love will be deficient not only in their relationships, but also in their thought. By contrast, to use words badly is to use them in a lifeless or death-inducing manner. The choice between Phaedrus, then, boils down to love or death. The risks of love can be avoided only at the cost of a kind of a premature or living death. This is what Socrates wants us to conclude. As Socrates sees things, the proper use of logos is to work toward and to be transformed by an increasingly clear grasp of the good, and that he takes to be an erotic undertaking. The more clearly we see the good, the more we long to bring ourselves into closer proximity to it. And the most promising pathway to the apprehension and internalization of the good is, so that in itself I think he takes to be erotic. And here I'm leaning on some of the views that Socrates attributes to Diotima in the Symposium. But this pathway is erotic in a second sense, as it's described in the Phaedrus. The most promising pathway to apprehension and internalization of the good, as described in the second of Socrates' two speeches, the so-called palinode in the Phaedrus, the most promising pathway is prolonged union and thoughtful conversation with a worthy lover. This is, for me, a thoroughly welcome departure from the vision Socrates puts forward in the Symposium, where he, or perhaps Diotima, whose words he channels, seems to characterize interpersonal love as a transient moment in the ascent to contemplative appreciation of an otherworldly form of perfect goodness. In the Phaedrus, it looks like love is something that is permanent in your perpetual striving to more closely approximate the good, has a permanent place in that striving. Still, despite the difference between these two dialogues, it's common ground between these two Platonic dialogues on love that the proper role of logos is to lift us to fuller understanding of the good, and that the driving force behind this ascent is eros. That's the common ground. Rhetoricians like Lysias have a completely different view of what words are for, what it's like to use them well. They compose their speeches with the sole aim of getting others to believe whatever they think it most advantageous to have them believe. The advantage Lysias seeks is reliable sexual access to the young Phaedrus, so he tries to convince Phaedrus that it's best to select an influential yet unloving suitor, such as Lysias himself. And Socrates claims that because the speech was devised by beginning with a fixed conclusion and working backward to premises that support it, Lysias's speech lacks the special sort of organic unity possessed by a living thing. The charge here, I benefited from some of Micah's input on this passage and how I initially wrote this little stretch of the paper. The charge here is not merely that the parts of the speech lack a functional relation to each other. Socrates is quite aware that Lysias's speech has been devised so that each part plays the functional role of supporting the favored conclusion, of making it likely that the result he's after will be brought about successfully. What Socrates seems to mean is that in choosing his words, Lysias has inverted the temporal direction of genuinely living thought. He began where living thought ends, with a conclusion, and he moves forward to where living thought ought to begin, with considerations that count in favor of and against various possible conclusions. Since the speech was not born, it was sort of reverse engineered. It wasn't born from one of those electrified strands of living thought in which opacity or perplexity about a crucially important aspect of the human good slowly gives way to a pleasing clarity. It's not, because it wasn't born in such an episode, it's not well suited to ignite such a transformative awakening in those who hear it. But this sort of awakening just is the distinctive and, by Socrates' lights, erotic activity of the human being. Other living things have a good. Their lives can go well or badly. But what's distinctive about the human being is that we are called upon to lift ourselves into closer proximity to the good from an appreciation of that very good. We're called upon to awaken to the good and lift ourselves to it from that awakening. The proper use of logos just is to advance in the Platonic understanding and understanding that appeals deeply to me. The proper use of logos just is to advance this distinctive form of becoming, in which we become good by awakening to the good. If the human being is or is the image of logos made flesh, what's at issue here is the refusal of the human, the turning of living flesh to stone. This was the special power or curse of King Midas. So it's quite apt that Plato turns to the myth of Midas to convey what's wrong with Lysias's way of stringing words together. What Socrates says is that Lysias's speech is just like the epigram on Midas's tomb. Here's the epigram. A bronze maiden I am, on Midas remains I lie. So long as rain falls and mighty oaks grow. Stationed here by this much lamented tomb, I announce to travelers by that Midas is buried here. What does he think is wrong with this speech? He thinks that the lines can be delivered in any order. They have no internal motion or momentum. Each of them is a self-standing unit. The poem is not arrived at by a kind of an episode of thought that unfolds. It's a succession of forethoughts, right? And so you can read those lines in any order you want, and they sound just as coherent or as incoherent as in the original order. This is the sense in which Socrates thinks that some strings of words have had the life taken out of them, right? Their order is irrelevant, right? And he thinks that the same can be said of Lysias's argument. You've got the fixed conclusion that's announced at the beginning, and then you've got the provision of a kind of a bullet point list of considerations that count in favor of the conclusion that don't build on each other and sort of add up to an episode of increasingly clear thinking, right? So both the epitaph and the Lysias of speech, lack the vitality, the erotic charge of a thought drawn forward by the glimmer of some half-seen truth. This is a deficiency that, in the rare case of Midas's tomb, makes the words perfectly fitting. But this deficiency doesn't make Lysias's words fitting. That deficiency is shared by his words, and it means that they lack erotic charge. His case for his case against Eros is exhibited as deficient precisely because of the lack of any sign of Eros in the case itself. What Plato is telling us with this stunning, I think, metaphor is that if you want to take the life out of someone, you should give them a feed of words and images selected in a purely instrumental spirit, and you should teach them to make similar use of their own power of logos. By contrast, if you want to enliven someone, as Socrates seems to want to enliven or re-enliven Phaedrus, you should offer them words that will induce them to reflect on how best to live and think, and you should encourage them to choose their words in this very spirit. I propose that this is how we ought to see the difference between the algorithms that give us our diet of online words and the ministrations of a good humanities professor, or of that stack of books we mentioned a few moments ago. And once we see the difference in this way, I don't think we need to say much more about why it is an impending cultural catastrophe, that our early and prolonged exposure to the former is dulling our taste for the latter. And the rise of the internet has offered some invaluable gifts to the humanities. We can instantly access an enormous library of texts that can serve as midwives of thought, both in the original and in translation. And we can instantly find published and even unpublished works that address almost any topic. We can identify and converse with people who share our interests no matter where on the planet they happen to be. But these impressive gifts, they really are impressive, are accessible through a medium that has itself become a powerful new form, a new force of socialization with results that are thoroughly inhospitable to the humanities and, I would say, to human flourishing. So we humanities professors are left then with impressive new tools at our disposal and fewer students who want to use them or are well prepared to make good use of them. That, I think, is the plight that we're in the midst of. I said earlier that I would discuss two changes that had been moving us toward cultural bankruptcy, one gradual and one abrupt, and we've dwelled at length on the gradual one. So let's now take a closer look at the sudden change now upon us, the release to the public of a surprisingly powerful new kind of generative AI. Where prior AI algorithms have been choosing the words and images that we consume, that we're exposed to, the new algorithms excel in producing words and other meaningful symbols for us. At the push of a button, they'll compose essays or novels or poems or movie scripts or musical scores or software programs in accordance with our instructions. And if we're not satisfied with the first draft, we can give them further instructions and have them take another crack at it till they give us something we like. Should we take them up on this offer? If I'm right that our strange new form of socialization has made it harder for our students to appreciate the point of the humanities, then they'll presumably be sorely tempted to do so when the due date for a humanities paper assignment approaches. But should they do so? What, if anything, would be lost if we, or if they, delegate the difficult and sometimes frustrating task of writing to these new machines? To answer these questions, let's try to place ourselves in the moment our students would be missing if we no longer gave them writing assignments. You are, let's say, at your word processor, and that, I think, is a lovely technological device. I'm not a thorough Luddite. So you're at your word processor, trying to put into words a thought you have, maybe about Plato's suggestion that love can take the form of an urge to beget the good in the lives of our fellow human beings. I say it's a thought you have, but if this is where you are at the keyboard trying to find words for it, then you're certainly not yet in complete possession of the thought. Because you do not yet fully possess it, your own propensity for love and your own approach to friendship or child rearing or pedagogy cannot yet be given a determinate new shape by this thought. Your task then is to come into fuller possession of it precisely by articulating it. Perhaps you try some words and they don't seem quite right, and then you strike upon what is, at least for the moment, a satisfying formulation of the thought your prior intimation was aglow with. This is a crucial moment of growth, both in our achieved articulacy and how we might go on to love or to parent or to teach. This is the sort of moment that makes it indispensable to have our students do their writing for themselves. It might seem, though, that the new generative AI programs can greatly facilitate such moments of growth, making them less laborious and more accessible even to poor wordsmiths. All we need to do is to input a prompt and let the AI take a stab at finding the right words for our half-formed thoughts. Then we can read its words and see whether they seem to hit the mark, and if they don't, we can tell the chatbot or whatever program we're using what to keep and what to change. Let it try again. In this way, we might hope to move quickly and frictionlessly to a revealing articulation of thoughts on the horizon of our thought, including our hazy intimations of the good. The new AI programs, then, can help us to attain to the human telos of lifting ourselves toward the good from appreciation of the good on this proposal. Well, this proposal, the idea now under consideration, is that our telos does not require us to be the ones who find the words that give shape to our evolving thoughts. This can be done for us. What our telos requires is only that we recognize the aptness of the words presented to us. But this strikes me as seriously mistaken. It is, of course, quite right that we can learn from and be shaped by the words of others, but this requires prolonged dwelling with and on and even in these words. This work of dwelling on words is precisely what we're taking up in humanities classes when we discuss and write about the text we've read. We cannot be spared this work by having at our disposal yet another text generated by an AI program. The work of growth cannot be made frictionless. We ourselves have to take on the arduous task of finding ourselves capable of living through the right words for the intimations that beckon us from just beyond the limit of our already worded understanding. We ourselves have to see and appreciate what's unveiled when the right words are found in order to be transformed from within by them, in order for information in the original and really worthy sense to occur. We do not, for instance, know justice or friendship or love just for having learned to make coherent use of the words that refer to them. We know justice or friendship or love. To know justice or friendship or love is the work of a lifetime. It involves a series of awakenings that cannot, by their very nature, be delegated. The humanities are the intensification and refinement of this work of awakening. Now, there are many forms of writing that can sensibly be delegated. A CEO can delegate the drafting of a business proposal without any irresponsibility, it seems to me. An entrepreneur can delegate the writing of an ad. There's some forms of writing that can't responsibly be delegated. We might be uncertain, for instance, whether a presidential candidate can responsibly delegate the writing of a speech. We're probably quite sure that there's something seriously wrong with delegating, say, the writing of love letters. The play Cyrano de Bergerac dramatizes the perils of this last delegation. The consequence of this delegation is that the one who pretends to have written the letters in the play, Christian de Neuvillette, is not the one Roxane comes to love, nor does his inchoate love for Roxane develop into the mature and lucid love that takes shape and gains expression in Cyrano's letters, and that would have made him one who could be a fitting lover for Roxane. He remains undeveloped, right, in virtue of not having done the work of bringing his initial inchoate feelings into words. Well, it seems to me that the writing at the focal center of the humanities is also, and for similar reasons, undelegable. To hand it off to an AI program would be to sidestep the task of self-development in which the humanities find their proper home. No one would be the least bit tempted to delegate the kind of writing we do in the humanities if this writing did not play the dubious role of sorting hat for advantageous starting points in highly paid non-academic careers. It would make no sense to do so except for that incidental fact about how we're lodged in the wider political economy. Now, when a fresh idea comes to full expression in us, we come into possession of a very interesting kind of good. To borrow from the economist's traditional categorization of goods and call these non-rivalrous would not be mistaken. Unless we're looking to publish our new ideas for profit, we can share them with as many others as we like without reducing the benefit that we derive from them. But to fully appreciate the pro-sociality of these special goods, new ideas, we have to go beyond noting that they occasion no inherent rivalry and take note of their impressive fecundity. Those who share their thoughts often find these thoughts refined and deepened by the resulting exchange. When others help you see further, this puts you in a better position to help others see further. And the more far-seeing and deep-thinking people there are, the easier it is to get such help. The fruits of deep reflection are then not merely non-rivalrous, but positively fecund. I suspect that this is one reason that what we call genius tends to occur in geographic clusters, as in the Golden Age of Athens or mid-18th century Edinburgh. But alas, the production and distribution of these goods does not always tend toward bounty. In a hostile social environment, the virtuous cycle of self-multiplication can easily be reversed, giving way to a vicious cycle of self-diminution. If our attention is fractured, if we limit the elaboration of our thoughts to pithy put-downs, if our typical response to the words and significant images of others is phrased in the language of likes and laugh-out-louds, if we have not honed our ability to bring our own inklings into words, we will be poor midwives to each other's emerging thoughts. Our most promising intimations will not achieve full expression. Our pregnant ideas will be stillborn. And to the extent that our development is stunted, we will unwittingly stunt the development of others whose thoughts we might otherwise have enlivened. Now, some economists think that the new generation of AI might finally produce that moment that Keynes predicted 93 years ago, the one he said was, in his moment, about 100 years off, in which we're able to enjoy ample levels of material plenty while devoting very little of our time to paid work in the formal economy. If this happens, if the curse of Adam really is greatly eased, this might well create a serious short-term economic crisis. But it might also open the longer-term possibility of vastly increasing that domain of the economy, here taken in the widest sense, in which we exchange the ideas and paintings and poems and plays and other fecund gifts central to the humanities. If we're well prepared for this moment, we might manage to make this domain an exceedingly valuable commons, geared not to the Midas-like business of turning living attention into gold, but to the cultivation of fecund communities of expression. The humanities would then have found their real, and I think very great, social value as gateway to and substance of this fecund and fully human economy. We could then stop peddling humanistic study on the basis of a contingent overlap between the sort of writing they require and the sort that has until now been demanded by lucrative jobs in the rivalrous economy with which we are familiar. Okay. One of the most popular books about how to write well is Anne Lamott's Bird by Bird. Lamott's title hides just behind the title I chose for this talk, Word by Word. In the little story that Lamott tells to flesh out her title, her father is giving encouragement to her 10-year-old brother who's struggling at the last minute to complete a grammar school paper assignment on birds. Bird by bird, buddy, the father advises. Just take it, bird by bird. I think it's telling that the father, himself a gifted writer, suggests a focus on the birds, not the words. For this is how we give nuance and determinacy to our evolving posture toward the people and things around us. We don't direct our attention at the words, but at what they signify, those elusive entities darting around at the far reaches of what we can make out by mind or eye. If we keep our attention on the birds, the words will come to us, and they will deepen and enhance our appreciation of the birds. This is decidedly not where the new large language model AIs look for guidance. They're not lodged in a life trying to make sense of the things around them or the path ahead of them. They're outside of life, scanning the vast collection of texts that have been generated by the living. They choose words in conformity with whatever patterns they can identify in the trillions of words on which they've been trained. That is, they find the center of gravity of prevailing thought, the red thread of statistically optimal conformity with what people say. Or, more accurately, they cleave optimally to the most common word sequences chosen by those who write, whether they write sophistically or in sincere quest for truth. While these new AI programs are sometimes said to be nearing human-level intelligence, this is, I think, misleading. Their form of thought is radically unlike our own. This is something Micah and my friend Bill Hasselberger have been writing on, I think, well. This is not merely because we lack the time or bandwidth to scan a trillion words. Even if we had the data processing and pattern recognition capacities of these impressive new entities, it would make no sense for us to adopt their standards of success as our own. If we did, we would have to count any radical departure from previous patterns of word strings as a failure of intelligence. This would be a hopelessly bad view, since it would categorize as unfortunate errors many of the most impressive intellectual and artistic breakthroughs in human history. But to see its hopelessness is to begin to see what would be lost if we outsource the kind of writing at the center of the humanities to these new forms of artificial intelligence. What would be lost is an invaluable manner of receiving and sharing those fresh ideas that arise from first-person engagement in the human form of being and living, and that result in individual and collective awakening. Put another way, what would disappear from the human world is a vitally important and fecund form of growth. Now, we have spent the past 15 months alternately marveling at and recoiling in fear from our own technological accomplishment. And understandably so. We've created entities with an intelligence that in certain narrow dimensions vastly exceeds our own. With this breakthrough, we seem to have equaled or exceeded what certain highly influential religious traditions regard as the consummate creative act of God, the creation of an intelligent being made in his own image. We're working hard to breathe life into our new creation, for instance, by putting its words in the mouths of avatars who offer simulacra of the friendship and intimacy that our solitarity has left us so hungry for. It will be a terrible irony, an irony of truly mythic dimensions, if the effect of this breakthrough is to bring a death-like stasis to our own form of being, the form we thought it so worthy a goal to replicate. Perhaps we need a reminder of the paradoxical fact that our form of being is a never-completed becoming. We should welcome technological innovations that help us with this task of becoming and refuse those that promise to spare us this task. Yet the difficulty of this task and our increasing immersion in a realm that leaves us badly unprepared for its rigors will sorely tempt us to opt for innovations of the second kind. If we do, we will not, in fact, have sidestepped the task of becoming. We will have engaged in it badly, becoming shallower, less fully human. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brewer, for a fascinating talk. We have plenty of time for questions. Just
Hi, thanks, Tal. So I thought that was really interesting. I have a question. I guess I'm trying to understand what you take to be the most valuable factor or the primary value in the following pair, because I thought there were two things that might have been at issue. So in some of your descriptions of what's gained through reflection on these great texts and so forth, you mentioned the sort of struggle, the devotion to these texts, the overcoming of obstacles and challenges that might hopefully result in a progressively clearer vision of the good. So that was one thing. And then there's the clearer vision of the good. So I guess I'm just wondering if you take the struggle, the growth, the striving to itself be something that we have reason to value, or if you see its value as primarily instrumental in that it's a possible path to this improvement in vision. I'm just thinking that depending on which way you go, you might think that there's a stronger case to be made for the value of the, in the first case, it looks like there's something that just couldn't be replicated by the AI systems and so forth, right? You're not going to get the growth, you're not going to get the struggle. It's fanciful, but you could imagine that somehow you get an AI system that just tells you, here it's the right value, right? So I was just thinking that that distinction might matter for the argument.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having a hard time imagining the achievement without the struggle, and so I feel like I want to say that I'd have to think about what it would be for them to be dissociated. There's a beautiful essay by Cora Diamond in which she's it's called "We Are Perpetually Moralists," and she's writing about Iris Murdoch on moral growth. And Murdoch is somebody I've really been influenced deeply by. And she says that Murdoch's criticism of Hare is, can be put in something like the following way. As Hare sees things, it's perfectly possible for a 15-year-old to be in possession of the most mature possible conception of, say, courage, right? It's not necessary for that to have come from any kind of episodes of growth or struggle. It could just happen to be struck upon. He might get the right extension for the concept, and then he's got it, right? You just need the right descriptive extension, and typically people take a while to work their way to that descriptive extension, but you might get lucky, or you might have a good guide, and then you've got it. And in a way, I think it comes down to what how we understand the epistemology of value, right? I suppose I think it's essential to the apprehension of value that that particular instances be vividly present to us, and that we build on our encounters with the particular instances of, say, love or courage, or Murdoch seems to think that this conception of language is depending upon encounters with particulars, extends outward to every bit of the language. But let's stay at in the core of key life-shaping value terms where her view seems most plausible. There she wants to say there is nothing that can be grasped apart from the slow awakening to the nature of the value that comes by the apprehension of of striking instances. And if that's right, then in a way this is a trick question, right? Yeah, and I'm tempted to say that it's a trick question. I just don't know what the epistemological achievement would be that yields ideality in the apprehension of the values that are central to a human life, that doesn't require a living, questing encounter with an actual biographically specific series of instances or episodes or encounters that enliven your sense of what that value is. Did you have a follow-up?
No, I mean, I think that's very helpful. I guess if insofar as I have a follow-up, it's just to ask whether you think that lies merely in the complexity of these things that are being grasped through this process of growth, or whether there's something about their nature. I mean, you can imagine that, or at least it seems to me possible to imagine that if we're just talking about some highly complex property, like a mathematical proof of something, that certainly while human beings actually have to like work toward that and slowly develop the requisite skills, there's no in principle obstacle to an AI just telling you what the right answer is, or some technology providing that answer. But you're suggesting that in the moral case, it's not like that.
Yeah. I mean, for me, a helpful analog is the aesthetic case, and there the Murdoch line seems really quite plausible. And so we have a critical vocabulary for music and for paintings and for movies and plays and so on and so forth. And we have different vocabularies for each of these art forms. And you could. What would it be for somebody to master the critical vocabulary but never to have seen a movie or a painting? Or I mean, I suppose I don't know how to bring that possibility into focus. So I suppose I think that that life experience is essential to the the apprehension of these properties. I mean, she calls these concrete universals, and that's a term that she borrows, I think, or so I've read, from the British Hegelians, and I don't know that literature well enough to fully reconstruct their grounds for speaking in these terms and her grounds for thinking that if you call these properties concrete universals, you've ruled out the possibility of apprehension except through concrete instances. But that's her view. While I can't give you a full elaboration in defense of it, it seems intuitively very plausible to me in at least a central range of cases, and that range is ample enough, it seems to me, to sweep in a lot of the stuff that you're thinking about when you're reading great literature or great philosophy, or so I wish I could be more helpful, but
Great. Other questions?
Thank you. So just have a question about this, the very central sort of claim you were trying to make in your talk. So you're talking about the humanities at the beginning a little bit as a division in universities as sort of institution, and then then you proceeded to sort of outline a conception of what the study of the humanities is for, which I think probably many people in this room are inclined to agree with. And then come back to the sort of institutional question. My question is whether we're talking about the same topic throughout the talk, whether the question of humanities as sort of institutional division of higher learning institutions, and the question that Plato is struggling with, for instance, are the same topic. Not to say that they are not crucially related, that the question, for instance, that the concept of university is constitutive of what humanities as we know them today, but the question of the nature of that constitution, I think, is one that we want to address if we want to then bring these higher conceptions of what the humanities are for to bear on very concrete questions such as what to do about ChatGPT. So yeah, I was wondering how you see that connections, which I take that for us is constitutive in some form. The form of that constitution is what I'm interested in.
Yeah. So the question is whether we're talking about the same thing when we talk about the aspirations of Socratic conversation and maybe the aspirations of the thing that Plato called the academy and what is called the academy today, what's called academic pursuits, or even within academic pursuits of the humanities. And so, is that the question?
Yeah, for instance, and one implication being, in one case you can meaningfully talk about bankruptcy. In the other case, I don't exactly. I mean, you might be able to, but it seems more difficult. At least one bankruptcy that doesn't imply the other.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what I'm championing when I'm championing the thing that I call the humanities is not what is taking place in departments that fall within the category humanities in contemporary colleges and universities. And there's some overlap between what I'm singing the praises of here and what happens in those departments, but certainly not a perfect overlap. And so, I don't want it to be a condition of adequacy of what I'm saying here, that it actually captures, what's going on in, in contemporary humanities departments, and so makes a persuasive case for doubling down on their funding and for steering students toward them so that, the teachings that are central to those departments can be offered to more people. I think that there are lots of individual departments and also some whole fields within contemporary academy in the widest sense that are in quite terrible shape and that need to be radically reclaimed. And so, I'm making, I suppose, a revisionist claim about what it would be what it is to practice the humanities well. One that, I'm moved by, and that would provide a kind of a lodestar for, pretty radical reformation of, not just contemporary universities, but the humanities parts of contemporary universities. And so I suppose for me, it's all, part of a wider story of bankruptcy would involve ways in which, faddish, self-enclosed, jargon-ridden conversations arise within actual so-called humanities departments and close themselves off to the entry into deep reflection about life of those who are not already converts to that enclosed, jargon-ridden conversation. That seems to me to be something that actual practices called the humanities are unfortunately subject to, and that we ought to call out. But am I addressing your question?
pushing. Yeah. So first of all, I'm asking implicitly whether that's not always been the case in Plato's Academy. The related question is there is an implicit normative assumption there about the relationship between humanities in the sense you want with a capital H that you want to talk about, and humanities as an institution that I think might be at the heart of our very anxieties about this, bankruptcy.
Yeah,
you see what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Perhaps that's not the only normative or the only constitutive form that this relationship can take.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well, it's true that I'm casting a critical gaze outward at influences from the wider world on the academy, and it would be a different essay to look inward at the academy and do a really fervent self-critique. And there would be lots of people, if I did such a thing, who would say, well, you've misunderstood what we're all about entirely. This is not, this is not what we set out to do. This is not why we pursued this. And then at least the debate could be had, right? I don't pretend that the conception of the humanities and of what it is to practice the humanities well that I'm offering here and sort of resting my case on is, unanimously certainly not even widely shared, it seems to me, in lots of so-called humanities departments. It's though I think that it attaches the practice of the humanities to fundamental human needs in a way that gives them what seems to me to be a very appealing and very urgently needed place in actual human lives, right? I don't know. I feel like I haven't answered your question still. Or
I really admire the paper, your talk.
Thank you very much.
Let me ask you this in as compressed way as possible. Where would you place the emphasis if someone were to say to you, don't you want to develop skills in today's youth? Don't you want to, or would you prefer to develop habits.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I was asked to evaluate a book on the history of habit.
Uh-huh.
So I'm thinking Aristotle, Hume, Kant's ambivalence, William James, John Dewey, Husserl, Merleau-Ponty. In a certain sense, I would also include Murdoch, but of course the people who contributed to the book had views about how does habit enable us to dwell in the world. And I was thinking perhaps, as you were talking, in terms of your book, which I think is wonderful, the retrieval, dialectical activity as a problem for propositionalism. The dialectic in Plato, in Socrates, in all of that. My God. It's saying to me, you were asking, to some extent, what sorts of habits do we wish to cultivate? How do we dwell? So I would take pause a little bit when you said the issue was the epistemology of value. I think it also has something to do with the phenomenology of value. And I see a lot of phenomenology in aspects of your book, where the role of ideals, ideality, is really important. How do you get from the implicit to the explicit and back? I thought you might say, we have enough tools today. We have enough skills. So 30 years ago, when I was in the faculty dining room with Bert Dreyfus, and Bert kept saying, no, skills are much more important than habit. And I said, bullshit. Would you be that rough with Bert?
I would want to back up and talk about what we mean when we speak of habit and habituation. I don't know which book you're talking about on history of habit, but I was a participant in a conference that took place a few years ago down at the University of Florida that was focused on habit and habituation and its role in ethical theory. And so I threw myself into drafting a paper on these on Aristotelian ethismos, which gets translated, habituation, right? And then, the question is, what was Aristotle on about, and is that translation a totally reliable one? And I'm not really sure that it is. So, what does the proper habituation deliver you to, right? Well, it will yield an outlook on what to do next that puts you in the category of the ideally virtuous person rather than the continent or incontinent person. And now, what is the distinction between the ideally virtuous person and the continent or incontinent person? Well, in Book 7, Aristotle talks about the ideally virtuous person theorizing, which means something like, vividly apprehending, being vividly aware of and being moved by, being gripped by, whatever consideration really is telling in the moment at hand, right? And so, this is what habituation, yields. If that's what it yields, it's not any, we certainly can't think of it as any kind of inculcation of a kind of an automatic propensity. It involves a phenomenology. And that phenomenology is a kind of awakeness to what matters. So it looks like in order for it to play the role that it needs to play in Aristotle's conception of how we become good, it's internal to the habituation that a kind of a permanent and reliable awakening is its yield, right? Its fruit. And I don't find the English language term habit or habituation very helpful to capture that central thought in Aristotle's picture of becoming good. But I think something like awakening is a better, or at least it helps to get at an aspect of what is involved in, what necessarily happens in the course of a proper Aristotelian habituation, if we want to keep going calling it that. And then you might ask, well, what is the nature of this awakening? And it looks like, I think common sense examples can be found. I don't know. I've got two grown boys. I watch them come into the human practice of friendship. And I've got a 9-year-old now who is well on her way, or pretty far into the same practice. And it seems to me that the entry into this practice is a very puzzling and interesting thing. You begin with certain outward motions that maybe you can be habituated to engage in. And that now we're talking about something that does sort of comfortably fit under the rubric of the English language term habit, right? But that's not where it ends. And if it ended there, you would only be halfway, right? As you're going through these predictable outward motions that could be inculcated by habituation, your eyes open to something, right?
But what is it that opens, if not the funded meanings?
The
funded meanings.
The meanings, yes.
The capacities for response, discernment, and attention.
Yes.
Possible.
Yes, this is it. And so if we build that into habituation, then I'm on your side in the dispute with Drebin. But if we flatten the idea of habituation in a way that is sometimes done in the literature on, the interpretation of Aristotle, then I wouldn't feel so vehement in my support of your position in the dispute.
I'm not sure whether.
So I'm going to allow myself a question here. And I think it's a kind of Aristotelian worry about this Platonic approach, and in particular with the idea that seems to be presupposed by this account and by Murdoch that virtue is always a form of knowledge. And I don't dispute, and in fact I join with you arm in arm in insisting on the essential and distinctively human character of doing our thinking for ourselves and the value of moving from the implicit to the explicit, and the way in which that both answers to distinctive dimensions of who we are as human beings and allow us to move toward an ever receding horizon of perfection. But I guess what I struggle with is seeing how this account deals with the reality that someone, I think, can maximally excel at the ability to think things through and speak eloquently and write eloquently, and not in a sophistical, sort of merely rhetorical way, but in a way where they are perfecting themselves in virtue of this particular capacity for thought. And someone can do all that and remain unmoved in some deep affective and practical level by the good that they realize and the good that they grasp. So, think about James Joyce, who's as a person is a bastard, but certainly seems to have as much command of the English language, and not in a merely artificial way, as anyone might. And so how doesn't the Murdochian account and doesn't this Platonic account leave something missing that disables us from being able to account for the difference between the person who moves word by word with perfection but remains unmoved in their will, and the person who, in addition to moving word by word to perfect their speculative and theoretical capacities, is also at the end of the day moved by the good that they behold? Isn't the beholding and the being moved by it in the end a distinction that matters? Or do you want to just say that beholding is merely artificial? And it's hard to square that with what
The
we
eloquent.
see in someone like a Joyce and so many others?
Yeah, these are hard questions. They seem to me to be joined at the hip with some reflections that, again, Mike and I were in the midst of very recently about. So, I mentioned the Socratic entry condition for, philosophical conversation, say what you think. And it does seem to me that that radically underdescribes the real entry condition. And your question seems to me to direct attention at what's missing in that description of the entry condition. Because you could really think something and yet be at arm's length from that thought, right? And, not feel as if, your being is, awaiting clarification somehow, right? And that it is, your future hinges in the balance, right? You can have an arm's length relation to, a thought and yet really think it, and you could enter it under that kind of aspect and with that kind of relation to it into what looks like a perfectly good Socratic conversation, and then arrive at further findings or conclusions about the inadequacy of your initial thought and new attempts to explore what is to be said in this domain, and yet somehow I think Micah's word for the deficient relation to your own words would be that whatever conclusion you arrived at is one that you could still shrug off, right? And I don't exactly know how to get deeper into the description of this distinction, but it seems like a crucially important distinction. I do notice that in at least some of, I told Micah that I want to go back and sort of make a catalog of the entry conditions of, of Socratic conversation and maybe chart some relations between the conversations that prove to be utterly untransformative and certain features of the entry conditions and vice versa. I think that would be quite interesting, but there are at least some of the entry conditions in which the person is really, riveted upon a life problem and is desperately in need of clarification about the life problem, right? Piety toward the Father would be an example, but there are many others. And, it seems to me that that kind of relation to the language is an essential precondition of the transformative effect of the search for articulacy. And that goes well beyond saying what you think. And so I do suppose that, I want to say that if, I don't want to speak about James Joyce. I don't know enough about his biography to feel confident in saying anything about his relation to his own words. But it seems to me at least a conceptual possibility and probably an actual lived possibility with many instances that people attain to a very high level of articulacy, but in a weirdly dissociated way. And that does seem to allow for, exceptionally sophisticated and nuanced articulations and insights, right? And so whatever it is that is involved in it's not being something you can shrug off is the missing thing that I'd be eager to hear your efforts too to more accurately articulate, right?
We'll give Micah has been mentioned a few times. We'll have the last question.
Okay.
Thanks, Tal. I had a kind of a comment and a question about the first part of the talk and the talk that leads up to the young man who's been acculturated going to college before going to college. And it's I guess the comment is it feels to me like you're sort of doing like kind of media ecology moves. I mean, sort of Marshall McLuhan, Neil Postman kind of stuff about how the form is shaping you. I think that's right, and I'm kind of wondering if that's the way you're sort of thinking about it.
Yeah,
in which case,
right.
I recommend them. Like Amusing Ourselves to Death is a wonderful, fun read, and it's a lot of. It's just like what you're doing about the internet. He's doing about television. So that's just kind of a thought. But then I guess
I think I am.
Yeah, I guess then kind of pushing you on that. It seems like I wonder if there's ways to sort of sharpen what the problem is. Like at times it seems like I get the point. That, it's like a casino. It's trying to demand our attention. But I can imagine someone saying, well, here's something else that grabs you. It's a soccer ball. And man, how many millions of human hours have been captured by this thing? You just get this thing in a dirt field, and it can like absorbed people, you know. But is that bad? Is it bad that we can be grabbed by a soccer ball or a basketball or something like that? I mean, there's lots of things that grab us.
Yeah.
And there's lots of things, and I can also imagine someone saying, and think about what we do on the internet. People spend hours, they get lost in ancestry and figuring out their ancestors. They also get lost in, you know, porn. Those don't seem like the same thing. So how much of it is a point about content? How much is it a point about form? You know, that it's training you to swipe left, swipe right, versus the actual stuff it's showing you? Is it an actual vision of the good? So those are kind of questions I think I had about the first part of the talk. It seems like there's room to refine what the actual worry is. And also, again, imagining people who would say, maybe it's not so worrisome. Or maybe it's actually not so different from these other things that we've come to see the value in, like sports or jazz, other things that people have, you know, been cranky about in the past.
Yeah. Well, I do think that words are special, and that a distorted relation to words is problematic in a way that a distorted relation to balls, if there is such a thing, is not. You know, and so you know, I guess, you know, some version of the Heideggerian proclamation that language is the house of being, you know, seems to fit the human form of being, and seems to say something quite important about it. And, you know, that means that how we arrange that house, how we introduce new generations to the house and show them around, is going to be a question of considerable moment. And that's what it seems to me distinguishes the allure of the soccer ball from the advisability of the sole application of the criterion of immediate allure to, you know, words offered up to new generations. Now, of course, there is an exaggeration in, you know, I mean, it would be, put it this way, it would be an exaggeration to suppose that all you do, all that anybody does on the internet is corrupting in this way. And I tried to, you know, come clean about the great possible benefits of some of the, you know, resources that are made available to us by the internet. And I suppose I think that researching family history might fall into that category. And, you know, it's notable that the places where these, you know, very valuable resources are to be found in virtual space are rarely governed by the design criteria maximizing time on screen and, you know, minimizing friction. And so, you know, I think there are protected zones and there are responsibly constructed zones in the wordosphere of the virtual world, and yet they're not the ones where most people spend most of their time. And, you know, they're so yeah. I don't know. Does that address the question?
Yeah, great answer. Yeah.
Well, thank you all for the gift of your attention this evening, and please join with me in thanking Dr. Brewer.
Thank you all.